Okay, boys and girls, this is going to be video 3 in the prop video, excuse me, Ken Smith Fishing. This will be video 3 of 4 now, so we're going to have 4 videos. In video 4, we're going to sit down and we're going to talk with Nick Petersen, who is the propeller manager for Mercury Racing. Actually, let me get his title exactly right for you. Performance Propeller Manager. So, and I've talked about this in another video, not in this series, but there's a lot of great prop guys around the country. But I wanted, look, there's not many companies that have their own lake, can have access to any boat they want, to do the research and spend the dollars on understanding props and lower units the way Mercury can. So through my connections, I'm obviously a Mercury Pro Staff guy, I had the ability to get a hold of Nick, and he's agreed, and we've gotten approval from the rest of Mercury, which by the way was not an easy thing, to do this video. So this is a 3-part series leading up to that, where we basically learned about props. If you haven't seen the first 2 parts, I'll post part 1 right there where you can go check it out. But so today we're going to kind of finish that up, us learning about props, because truthfully I wanted to go into this well-educated where I had good questions to ask him, and then you guys have submitted a bunch of really good questions. I'm going to go through those at the end of this video as well, in case in the next week, it's going to be about a week after I post this before we'll film that video. Sorry, that was the sound of me breaking another GoPro. Anyway, so we'll have about a week before we film the section with Nick. So if you have questions after you watch this and see the questions we've already got to pose to him, please let me know. KenSmithFishing@Outlook.com, YouTube or Instagram. Instagram is KenSmithFishing 2.0, and then of course YouTube, Facebook, and I'm pretty easy to find, Ken Smith Fishing. So, all right, so let's dive into this particular video. And so we left off talking, we got right up to ventilation, and there is a ton of confusion about this. So many propellers have those little holes drilled in the bottom of them. Mercury has a specific name for them, but they're vent holes or portholes. And the idea behind that is to let exhaust flow over the outside of the hub. So before we go there, let's just talk, because as I thought about this, I thought, some guys probably don't understand exactly how exhaust leaves an outboard motor. So you can see on this diagram, most outboards and most props that we run outboards have what they call through hub exhaust. So you see in that top, so matter of fact, in that middle diagram is a cutaway of a Mercury 4-stroke engine. And I'm not a mechanic, but I believe that red section would be where the exhaust comes down, and basically then it pours out alongside of the prop shaft. So it can come through the hub of a propeller, or it can come around the hub of a propeller. Now, that particular diagram I think is a little bit confusing, so go to the right side where you see that chopper prop over there. And what you see is that very small hub that only basically encompasses the prop shaft, and then that black space where I've drawn that arrow going in there, that's where excuse me, where those exhaust gases would escape the lower unit. Now, we talked in an earlier video that it would seem like you would create a ton of cavitation when you run that particular kind of prop, because you got all those exhaust fumes going over the prop. And in fact, you would if it was a submerged style lower unit. Most of the time when you see these props with the hub exhaust ventilation systems, they're going to be in surfacing props. So what happens is, as that prop shaft comes out of the water, the exhaust is going to escape the top half of the prop shaft where there's no water pressure. So that's why you can run those styles of props and not have a ton of cavitation or ventilation. But let's go back to our first video. Okay, so sorry, toddler and just chaos. Anyway, so that's what that's designed to do, is to allow the exhaust to escape around that hub. Now, the vent holes in these props, I got a lot of questions about this. Guys, this only comes into play at hole shot. And should you take them in, should you take them out is a very simple question. How's your hole shot? The idea behind them is, if your motor bogs down when you try to put it on pad, if it bogs down, if you will open some of these holes up, what it does is it allows that exhaust to escape and run over the top of the prop shaft, over the top of the propeller hub, onto the blades, and it allows it to cavitate, so it builds RPMs. We're going to talk to Nick a little bit more about this, but every motor has basically a form of a power curve, if you will. And you've got to get your motor into that power curve of RPMs to where you can get it up on the pad. So if you are struggling with the motor bogging down, you might want to pull some of these plugs out. Now, the other side of that coin is if you pull too many of them out and you pour too much exhaust over the top of that prop, then you start spinning the prop out. So you'll hear it. You heard it. Matter of fact, if you go back in the ballistic video, you heard when he got in that prop, when Mike got in it, it would take off and then it would spin a little bit because it was a little bit too much exhaust gas going over that prop. So that's what those are for. They have nothing, they do nothing once the prop's to speed, because once the prop's to speed, there's water pressure over them and the exhaust then escapes back to our prior diagram, top left. It escapes through the hub. So that's all that is. There's no reason to worry about it. It really has no performance value or detraction from performance once you're up on the pad and running, okay? Now, since we're talking about cavitation / ventilation, I want to also talk about this, and I am guilty of this. So I always call that plate above the prop shaft, the cavitation plate or a cav plate. I always call it a cav plate. It's not. It's actually an anti-cavitation or anti-ventilation plate. And the idea behind that is you get in trouble, you can get in trouble a lot of ways running an outboard. But the 3 ways you can really get in trouble is, is when you lose bite with your propeller, okay? And the most common cause of that, and if you Google boat wreck on YouTube, the first video that pulls up is that guy in that bass bump, and he jumps that wake, and he loses bite when he comes back down, and he did what's called a bow hook. And all a bow hook means is you lose bite, and now the keel of that boat on the front half of the boat steers that boat. And if you ever watch that video, he jumps over that, he gets a little bit sideways in the air, and when he hits down, the prop is no longer steering the boat, the front of the boat steering the boat, and that boat hooked and it throws him out. And there's a ton of those videos, those high school, college kids a couple of years ago. I know they claimed that they had motor malfunction. They didn't. I knew somebody who was there. They just hooked the boat. They came across the same thing that guy did in the FLW tournament the other day. They're running too high on the pad. They lose bite, and when they lose bite, the front of that boat steers, and when it does, it hooks and it will throw you out. So the way that happens is one of 2 or 3 ways that you can lose bite. This is one of the ways, right? Suddenly air can come down that, basically come down that prop shaft and get into your motor, get into your propeller, and you lose bite and bad things happen. Second way it can happen, and probably the most common that we just talked about, is where you're cornering and the prop is too high out of the water. You lose bite, boat spins you around and you're in the water. Hopefully you're not hurt real bad. And then the third way is, which we're going to talk more about this, most submerged lower units that are designed to be run not partially out of the water, will at some speed, and we're going to talk to Mercury Racing about this a little bit more, I hope, will at some speed create a bubble, if you will, where they're going so fast it starts pushing the water around the hub, around the lower unit. And the number I hear on a Torque Master is mid-80s. Now, I've never scared mid-80s in my Ranger other than behind my pickup truck. But there is a speed at which you can have a problem with that water getting pushed away from the prop and you lose bite. So just know that that's out there, but know that if you damage your lower unit like this, if you knock a hole in your anti-cavitation plate, which I have done, you need to get it fixed because this can create problems. And in the next video as well, on that last video, you saw even with the Torque Master, you're running a whole bunch of that motor out of the water. If you knock that skeg off, you've knocked off a whole bunch of your ability to steer this boat. And you hit a little wake wrong, you could lose steering just like that, and that's how people get hurt. So these are not expensive to fix. If you have one of these problems, just take it to a good repair shop and they'll fix it, and it's not at all an expensive thing. Talked about rabbit holes. This is another one that I went down because I've seen a prop do this. That prop is damaged, so water boils at about 210 degrees. And you know what? I want to make sure I get this right, so bear with me for just a second. I want to reread something. Okay, so I'm just going to read this to you. So it says, water boils at 212 degrees Fahrenheit, 100 degrees Celsius, at normal sea level atmospheric pressure. But it also boils at room temperature if the if the atmospheric pressure is low enough. So what can happen with a prop is you drop the pressure. Remember, there's a positive and a negative side of a propeller. You drop that pressure so low, water starts boiling. And this damage you see on your screen right now is a result of that and the microscopic bubbles basically racing across. Now think about that. Racing across a stainless steel propeller blade, it can cause this kind of damage. Now, I went down a really interesting rabbit hole about this, but one of the things it says is most of the time this is caused by a very small nick or damage in the blade or propeller, which is what will cause this. So if you start seeing signs of this on a prop, you probably need to get that prop off and get it to a good prop guy and let him look at it, because there's most likely something going on in the structure. It can be also bad design on a prop, but it's most likely something wrong with the structure of the prop, and you're going to destroy that prop. Okay, so again, some of this stuff is just stuff I found interesting as I worked through this. So let's talk a little bit about angle of attack. And this is, so on the left you've got an airplane wing, right? And what we know is, so if an airplane wing is symmetrical and it has no angle of attack, you see up there at 423, there's no lift. The plane will not fly. So what has to happen is you have to give it an angle of attack. And when you do that, you create negative pressure on top of the blade, positive pressure on the bottom of the blade, and you get lift. And by the way, it's an interesting note to me that we're running 60s, 70s, 80 mile an hour in a bass boat, and a Cessna takes off, I think it's 67 miles an hour. So it's kind of appropriate that there's a picture of a Cessna. I think that would be, actually, I don't know what that is. I'm guessing that's a Piper. But anyway, that there's a picture of an airplane in here and we're talking about lift. But what you see then on the right is so the angle of attack of the blade. Now, I couldn't find good data on this, but I thought it was interesting that, to me, that was about well, I don't know what that angle is off perpendicular to the prop shaft. But you can see when you start getting an angle of attack there, that's when you start getting thrust, and that's what makes a bass boat go forward. So I did that because this was interesting to me, that there is a curve, like there is in most things, that there is a point when as you increase the angle of attack, your efficiency gets better to a point, and then it starts falling back off. And kind of back to the whole art and science thing here, figuring that out is the trick, right? If we all ran the same boat with the same load and the same conditions, I mean, think about it, barometric pressure, wind, temperature, all of those things, then there would be a prop we would all run. But that's not the case. There are so many variables in this calculation that you have to do a lot of trial and error. But we're trying to learn enough here to at least know where to start our trial, to do our errors, to know which props we want to try to start out with. So just know that there is a sweet spot on most props, and you're going to see in one of my questions, or in all props, I guess there's a sweet spot, but on most boats there's a sweet spot of a prop, RPMs, slip, etc. that's going to get you the best performance in any given condition. Now, we actually never have addressed exactly what slip is, but you can see here, this pulls that angle of attack piece off the last slide, and there is a theoretical amount of movement you get forward from a prop. We covered that in video 1 based upon the pitch. So theoretically speaking, a 23 pitch propeller, every revolution of that prop would move the boat forward 23 inches. The amount between what that number is and how much it actually moves the boat forward is the amount of slip. And there's a prop slip calculator on the Mercury Racing. There's probably a number of them, but I've been using the one on the Mercury Racing website where you can go in, and what you got to know is you got to know your pitch on your prop. You got to know what your lower gear casing ratio is, which most of them is 1.75. You got to either know your speed. I think you got to know your speed. You got to know RPMs, and then it will tell you your prop slip. And if you have any one of those missing, it'll back into that number for you. So there you go. Okay, so we've already talked about pitch. That's just a better slide of the same thing. That first slide was not real clear, so I stuck that slide in there as well. Now, interestingly, I thought when I started this process that you basically wanted zero slip, right? But in fact, that's not the case, because too little slip, typically the prop diameter is too large for the engine. You're wasting power in blade friction, and therefore that friction is not allowing that prop to produce as much thrust as it might otherwise. Or it can be really bad for your drive case and gear components. And the point here that I was given was, if you put in a diesel pickup truck, if you put too much power to the U-joint too quickly, it'll twist it off, right? So in our world, in the fishing world, that little bit of slip is what saves you from tearing up the inside of your lower unit, because you don't overpower the gears inside the lower unit, if you will. That's probably an awful explanation, but I think you guys get that point. You could actually have too little slip and cause problems for your lower unit, for your motor. And then obviously too much slip, a lot of times it's because your diameter, your prop's too small for the power and the load. Can also occur when you got too much cavitation or ventilation. And basically what that, as we've already talked about, causes is less water in contact with the blade surface, and therefore you're not getting the performance you should have out of that. So the perfect amount of slip gets you the most efficient use of power from the prop shaft to the prop pushing you down the lake. Again, it's art and it's science. Rabbit hole alert. So this was one that I sort of knew, but I had never put the numbers to it. So, and it's interesting. So if you go back, so as I mentioned a second ago, the lower gear ratio on my 250 Pro XS, and I'm going to show you here in a second, on most TorqueMaster lower units is 1.75 to 1. Now I found this, that little clip at the top, the Mercury Mariner 79 to 2015 V6s, most of them had a gear case of 1.87 to 1. You can see there the Verado. I know it's really hard to see, but you can get the Verado in a 1.75 or a 1.85 to 1. The TorqueMaster is a 1.75, we already talked about. The Sportmaster is 1.60 to 1. And then actually I didn't show that a second ago. That's a Bravo lower unit, Bravo 1 lower unit over there on the right. It can be run in a 1.36 to 1, a 1.50 to 1, or a 1.65 to 1. Now, most people have never thought about this, but if your motor is turning, let's just say 6,000 RPMs, your prop is not turning 6,000 RPMs, because you got to run it through that gear ratio. So in fact, I built this little table for us in a, let's just use my motor for example, 1.75 to 1. If I'm turning 6,000 RPMs at the power head, I'm really only spinning that prop 3,429 RPMs. So what you see here is my same RPMs in that Bravo turns it at 3,750. By the way, that 1.87 to 1, am I getting that right? No, I'm sorry. The Suzuki, I had to think about that for a second. The Suzuki 250 motor is a 2.08 to 1 gear ratio. And so, and I'm not bashing on Suzuki, I'm just telling you what I've heard. I've heard in general the Suzuki is pretty slow, but I had a viewer say he's running his 250 Suzuki, I can't remember what boat he's running, but he's turning a 27 pitch and running pretty dang fast. Well, it makes sense, right? It's a lower gear ratio, so he can turn a bigger prop. So again, he's got a whole different set of sweet spots he's got to work around. But all things being equal, if you could run the same prop on all of these, and I just put in here, let's just say it's a hypothetical 24 pitch with a 15% slip, look at the amazing difference in, for example, the Suzuki running 55 miles an hour versus that Bravo running 85 miles an hour. So it doesn't mean anything. I just thought it was interesting, and as I said, it was a rabbit hole. Now, by the way, that next slide shows you, this shows you how important reducing slip to your kind of optimal on that performance spectrum is on that curve we talked about. Go down to mine again. So if I could turn that 24 pitch with a 15% slip, 6,000 RPMs, I could run 66.2 miles an hour. If I can drop that slip to 10%, I pick up 5 miles an hour or 4.9 miles an hour, and I can run that 70.1 miles an hour. So again, it was a rabbit hole, but I thought it was interesting.
Guys, we got enough material. I'm going to stop here with video 3, and I'm going to post video 4 tomorrow. We're going to cover diffuser or tube flare, tube length, and then we're going to talk about some of the questions that we've already got posed for Nick, and then ask you guys for additional questions. So stick around. Video 4 will be up tomorrow. Thanks, guys.